My name is Meredith Denning. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgian Bay Association. I'm so glad you can all join us tonight. And our host this evening is going to be the chair of our Fisheries and Aquaculture Committee, Jim Rusak. He's going to lead us in a land acknowledgement and then introduce our special guest, Arūnas Liskauskas, recently of the Ministry of Natural Resources of Ontario. Hello, Jim. Take it away.
Thank you, Meredith, and again, welcome all. So glad to have you join us this evening. So before I introduce Arūnas, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which we are meeting is home to many Indigenous peoples and that have been living here in their ancestral lands and unceded territories from time immemorial. GBA honors, recognizes, and respects these traditional stewards of the land and water on which we gather. We encourage all do their part in striving to improve the relationship between Indigenous and settler communities. We are aware of the need to learn the history, spirituality, and culture of the Indigenous people. And we are grateful that the path to true reconciliation has begun. We commit to live in harmony, respect, and right relations with our Indigenous neighbors to whom we give our thanks. Personally, as a limnologist and freshwater ecologist, I study the waters of inland lakes, largely in the tradition of Western science, though. In Indigenous cultures, in particular the Anishinaabe, water is recognized as an entity with a spirit, and in contrast to being a resource to be exploited or enjoyed, it is a life-giving gift from Mother Earth to be nurtured and respected. So I find this way of conceptualizing water something we can and should incorporate more into our conservation and remediation of aquatic systems as we move forward with those efforts. I'm certain it will lead to better outcomes, both for our lakes and rivers, as well as our path to reconciliation. So, thank you. And we have the pleasure of having Arūnas Liskauskas with us today to give us his presentation, Beneath the Surface. You will be um, suitably entertained. It's a really nice presentation. Arūnas really has had a life and career defined by fish. He spent his youth learning to fish in the waters of Severn Sound near Wabashin, which naturally led to the pursuit of wanting to learn more about everything fishy. After obtaining an honors BSc in fisheries science and an MSc in fish genetics at the University of Guelph, he eventually arrived back at his home waters of Georgian Bay and Lake Huron as a management biologist with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. So after 35 years of being with the MNR and leading the fisheries effort in Georgian Bay, he retired in March, and he's starting a new chapter of discovery that will most likely continue to involve fish in one form or another. So thanks again, Arūnas, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it's so nice to be able to share some time with all of you this evening to talk about fish. I just wanted to point out that I have my musky head here accompanying me for security and for comfort, just in case you were wondering. I'm really glad to be given this opportunity to present this talk to you. You'll notice from the title slide that I'm using retired MNR biologist. Really, this is one of the first talks that I'm giving with that retired moniker. So far, the first 6 or 7 weeks of retirement have been pretty amazing. However, I didn't want to sever my links to outreach and education totally. And I'm so grateful for the Georgian Bay Association for giving me this opportunity to speak with you about fisheries in Lake Huron in particular. So it's not the complete story, but it is one version of insights that I've been able to gain with 35 years of experience working on the lake. So without further ado, we'll get to the next slide, please. I just wanted to acknowledge all the agencies and entities that have provided a lot of the supporting information that I'm going to be presenting to you this evening. This information is up to date up until the current year. So you'll be really getting some interesting insights into the state of fish communities in Lake Huron. And I must say that it's not going to be comprehensive. The story about fish communities in the lake is varied and complex and very interesting, but it would take a few hours of a workshop to cover it all. So I'm going to highlight some of the major features that are of interest to hopefully most of you this evening. So next slide. So this montage of images of aquatic habitats distributed throughout eastern Georgian Bay and the North Channel of Lake Huron reflect my office environment for the last 35 years. So I've been privileged to be able to work in what probably is the most diverse and unique of the Great Lakes. This next image depicts the bathymetry of Lake Huron. The darker shading of blue indicates deeper waters, and the lighter shading of blue indicates shallow waters. So you could see that in the main basin of Lake Huron, the northern portion of the main basin has most of the deep water habitats, whereas the southern areas, including Saginaw Bay, are more shallower waters. And when you look at Georgian Bay, the west coast of Georgian Bay is much deeper than the east coast. And the east coast, the territory or the area that occupies the Georgian Bay Association, that's a very extensive littoral shelf of aquatic habitat that provides all the necessary elements for supporting a diversity of fish communities. And then the North Channel is kind of an intermingling of the two. It's a transition zone. It receives the cold, relatively sterile waters from Lake Superior via the St. Mary's River. And it's relatively shallow, but it does have some deep water pockets that support some deep water fish species. So that's just a general layout of the depth characteristics of Lake Huron. And that depth really influenced the composition of the fish communities that are found in those waters. Next slide. So here's the main features, the main elements that I'm going to be addressing in my presentation. Now, hopefully you won't be overwhelmed with this list of items. I'm just going to briefly highlight them. Sea lamprey is still a major influence on offshore fish communities, and I hope to show that in the ensuing slides. There are distinct basin and regional differences in fish community composition. As I've mentioned, the depth profile of the lake basically contributes to supporting different fish communities. We've in recent decades experienced an intense disruption in the lower food web, and I'll elaborate on that in later slides. The pelagic preyfish. Pelagic preyfish are those fish that are in offshore waters that inhabit the water column and aren't the fish that are associated with the bottom benthic areas. So pelagic are those offshore fish species that are critical to supporting predator populations in the lake, and they are currently found at very low levels of abundance. Lake whitefish, which is a very culturally and economically important fish species, is in critical decline in many areas of the lake. Lake trout, the apex predator in the lake, has been recovering somewhat. The recovery is variable, and it's been primarily noticed in the main basin and Parry Sound. And I'll provide some more details on that. Walleye, which is a very important and popular nearshore and midshore predatory species, has increased in abundance substantially in Saginaw Bay. But in general, most of the areas of Georgian Bay and the North Channel still have walleye populations that are not nearly as abundant as they were historically. And then I'm going to touch upon some of the other species of interest in the nearshore and midshore areas and talk about how dynamic and diverse they are. So next slide. So I'm going to start with key invasive species. So these are species that were not native to the fish community in the Great Lakes and were established primarily through the introduction from ballast water discharges from ocean-going vessels. So there's a long history to sea lamprey, which I'm going to cover in the next few slides. Next slide, please. And basically, the take-home message for sea lamprey is that they are still a species of fish that dictates the dynamics of offshore fish communities in Lake Huron and all the rest of the Great Lakes. There's a graph on the top right there that shows the abundance, the relative abundance of adult sea lamprey over the last 40 years. So from 1985 to 2025. So the general trend has been a declining abundance of adult sea lamprey as a result of the Sea Lamprey Control Program. This is a $20+ million program that is done on an annual basis by both the US and Canadian governments, and it's coordinated by the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. And it's a multi-pronged effort aimed at reducing the abundance of this particular invasive species. And that's primarily through the application of lampricides in tributary systems that the sea lamprey use for reproductive purposes, as well as barriers. Now, I could probably spend several hours talking about sea lamprey and their dynamics, but I'm restricted to a 45-minute presentation. So I'm just going to point out that currently, sea lamprey abundance has been reduced by 90% from what it was historically. And if you look at the most recent time frame from 2020 to 25, the average abundance of sea lamprey adults is about 45,000 individuals, whereas historically there were over 700,000. And there's a blip there that you see from 2021 to 22. And I just wanted to highlight that because it indicates how committed we have to be to controlling the species. So during the COVID epidemic, the sea lamprey control folks were not able to apply lampricide to the tributary systems because of safety reasons. So there was no lamprey control for a whole year in 2020. And we saw that in 2021 and 23, there was an increase in the abundance of adult sea lamprey. So all it took was 1 year of non-treatment of lamprey for their abundance to appreciably increase. So basically, the take-home message here is that we are locked into trying to control their abundance, and there's really no other solutions available to keep them at bay. If we did not control sea lamprey, all the large-bodied fish in the lake would likely go or be exterminated within the first 5 to 10 years. So invasive species, once they're established, they're with us for the long term, and they're very difficult to manage. One of the things that we do to stop adults from going upstream is to provide barriers and we have fishways at some of these barriers that allow some species of fish, mostly jumping non-native salmonid species, to pass. Unfortunately, these barriers don't allow native species to move up to their traditional spawning locations. So we're in a bit of a conundrum trying to suppress lamprey abundance, but knowing that a lot of our tributary systems are compromised because we can't allow a lot of the native species to reach their natal spawning grounds. Next slide. So sea lamprey were established in the 1930s, and so they've been with us for close to 100 years. I'm going to highlight some of the more recent invasive species that have entered Lake Huron as well as the rest of the Great Lakes, and just the detrimental ecological impacts that they've had. So this second wave of invasive species, again introduced through ballast waters, occurred in the early 1990s to early 2000s. And they involve species that hopefully most of you are aware of, the zebra mussel in particular, the round goby, the spiny water flea, and more recently, a relative of the zebra mussel, the quagga mussel. And that quagga mussel has transformed the lower food web of Lake Huron, reducing the amount of nutrients in the offshore waters of Lake Huron as well as the other Great Lakes. So I'm going to provide some examples as to the impact that these invasive species have had on fish communities in Lake Huron in particular. Next slide. So this is an example of the impact of invasive species on a variety of species, not only fish, but also species in the lower food web, like benthic organisms. So the top graph is an illustration of the distribution of quagga mussels from 2000 to 2022. The blue areas highlighted, the darker the blue, the more dense the populations of quagga mussels. You can see that over that 20 plus time frame, quagga mussels now occupy most of the bottom of Lake Huron. And in contrast, when you look at the bottom graph, which shows a time series of the abundance of Dipraia. Now, Dipraia is a benthic amphipod. It's an organism that has a high lipid content. It's about a centimeter in length, and it was a primary species of forage for a lot of fish. And you can see that over a 22-year period, it has almost disappeared from the bottom of the lake in Lake Huron. So we've lost a high nutrient benthic species that was forage for a lot of fish species, and it's been replaced by the quagga mussel. Quagga mussel does not have a lot of lipids. It does not have a lot of nutritional benefits to fish, and it's basically taken over the benthic areas of the lake. So fish now have a lot less nutrient-rich feed in which to feed on and grow in the last 20 plus years. Next slide, please. So what are the implications of the lower food web being impacted so dramatically by Dreissenid mussels? And one way that that's expressed is through prey fish. And I'm going to highlight some of the impacts that low nutrients in the offshore waters have on the abundance of prey fish. Next slide. So this is a graph that shows the abundance of offshore prey fish in Lake Huron from about 1975 to 2025. And the various colors on that graph indicate the biomass of various prey fish species. So you see that in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, the most abundant prey fish were alewives and rainbow smelt. So yellow is the alewife, green is the rainbow smelt. And what we've seen, and those two fish species, by the way, that you can see on the right-hand side, in the middle is alewife and the bottom is rainbow smelt, those were introduced species. So they were not native to the Great Lakes. They were able to gain access to the lower and upper Great Lakes as a result of the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And that allowed these fish that are native to the Atlantic coast to make their way to the upper Great Lakes. And they made their way up to the upper Great Lakes at a time when sea lamprey had decimated populations of lake trout. Prey fish abundance had declined, and basically they were replaced by alewives and rainbow smelt in those offshore waters of Lake Huron. So their abundance was very high, and that kind of triggered efforts on behalf of many fisheries resource agencies to try to reduce their abundance because they were overpopulating the offshore waters of Lake Huron in the 60s and 70s. And I don't have time to go over all the details of how they've changed the dynamics of the lake, but you could see that with the establishment of quagga and zebra mussels in the late 90s and early 2000s, by 2000 and 2010, we saw a dramatic decline in the abundance of alewives and smelt. They actually crashed in abundance in about 2003, and that was primarily because there was very little plankton and zooplankton for them to feed on in the offshore waters. I'm just going to highlight briefly that the bloater chub, which is in the top right-hand portion of this slide, that is now the most abundant offshore prey fish. And it's the only representative of what used to be a deep water Cisco species flock in the offshore waters of Lake Huron. Most of those species have been extirpated because of ecological change and overexploitation, and only the bloater remains as the native offshore prey fish. But you can see that in recent years, the biomass of offshore pelagic prey fish is much lower than it was historically. Next slide. So we have a lot less prey biomass in those offshore waters. However, we do have one species of introduced fish, an invasive species, that being the round goby, that now occupies the offshore bottom waters of the lake. So round goby, they were introduced in the early 1990s, and they've expanded their presence on the lake. So they're basically situated throughout Lake Huron and are now the primary prey fish for most predatory fish in the lake, which is quite a dramatic change from what we saw historically in the lake. And one of the things about round goby is that they're very cryptic. They tend to hide in crevices and rocky areas, so they're very difficult to monitor and assess. In recent years, some new technologies have been utilized and adopted to try to understand the abundance of round goby in the waters of Lake Huron. So up in the top right hand, you see a representation of GobyBot, which is a vehicle that is automated, and you can track or plan a route for it to take throughout the waters of Lake Huron, and it takes high resolution images of the bottom, and it's able to convert those images into a graphic that enables software programs to enumerate the presence of round goby. And just to give you an example of how abundant round goby are, we're going to go to the next slide. We were able to do a more detailed assessment of round goby abundance in one specific location, that being in Owen Sound in southern Georgian Bay. And we utilized electrofishing as a tool to enumerate the abundance of round goby in the bottom waters of Owen Sound. You could see the device on the top left-hand side. It's just a metal cradle that is electrified and dropped to the bottom of the lake. It encompasses a specific bottom area that you can take high resolution photographs, apply electric current. It partially or temporarily stuns the goby in the area, and you're able to enumerate the number of goby within that location. And then you're able to extrapolate based upon the surface area, the bottom surface area of Owen Sound, and get an estimate of the abundance of round goby. So the bottom left-hand graph is just a bar graph showing the estimated number of round goby by depth strata. So on the x-axis, the bottom axis, it shows the various depth strata, 0 to 5 meters, 5 to 10 meters, all the way to 100 meters, so over 300-foot depths. And basically, the take-home message from this graph is that the round goby are most abundant in rocky substrates in nearshore waters. However, they're also found in waters over 300 feet deep. And when you enumerate the number of round goby within Owen Sound during the day, when they're situated in crevices, so they're not as abundant as during the night. During the day, we estimated that there were 118 million goby in the bottom waters of Owen Sound. And at night, the estimate was 144 million goby, or about 237 tons. So it's hard to get your mind around those numbers, but let's just say that round goby are very abundant in the bottom waters of Lake Huron, and in particular in Owen Sound. and they are now a primary prey fish for a number of predatory species in Lake Huron. So next slide. Deep water fish. So we're going to talk about lake trout. Next slide. And we're going to start with a bit of a video just to set the mood. Hopefully you could all see this. There should be a musical accompaniment, very dramatic music that I don't hear, unfortunately. Maybe I'll shout out to Meredith. So in the absence of the dramatic music as the backdrop, this video is an example of a stocking event for lake trout in the offshore waters of Georgian Bay near the Limestone Islands. So just offshore from Parry Sound. And it's an example of a stocking event that involved tens of thousands of yearling lake trout that are stocked on an annual basis in various locations throughout Georgian Bay and Lake Huron. And it's an attempt on behalf of fisheries management agencies to reestablish this apex predator that used to be very abundant in the offshore waters of Lake Huron. And unfortunately, we did not have sound for that. So it wasn't as dramatic as it could be, but I'm hoping that Meredith will be able to work on the audio for some subsequent video that we have later on in the presentation. So next slide. Oh, okay. I thought we were going to try to get that video again. So I just wanted to highlight that in this presentation, I'm going to be using some information that has been summarized in an incredible documentary by Inspired Planet Productions. And it tells the story about the offshore fish species in Lake Huron, as well as the Great Lakes. And if some of you have not seen this documentary yet, go to the TVO website, TVO Docs, and look for All Too Clear. It's a three-part series that highlights the impact of Dreissenid mussels, both zebra and quagga mussels, and how they've transformed the ecology and the food web of the Great Lakes. So it's something that you'll want to see. Next slide. So I mentioned lake trout. It's the keystone predator, or has been the keystone predator since the last glacial period in the Great Lakes. And this is just a slide depicting the commercial harvest of lake trout historically and where it is currently. So you could see that it was an incredibly abundant species, very important in the commercial fishery. In some years, over 3 million kilograms of lake trout were harvested. And then you could see that precipitous drop in the mid-1940s, and that was a result of sea lamprey. They decimated lake trout populations throughout the Great Lakes, including Lake Huron, and basically extirpated all our native lake trout genetic resources up until 1960. The only populations that survived were the Parry Sound population and Iroquois Bay in the extreme northern part of Georgian Bay. So that was the only genetic legacy left behind from lake trout that used to be very abundant and very diverse. So since the 1960s, we've been trying to reestablish lake trout in the Great Lakes using a variety of strains, primarily Lake Superior, because those lake trout populations persisted, whereas in the lower Great Lakes, they were extirpated. And then we've also used some external sources of lake trout genes, primarily the Finger Lakes and Seneca Lake. So we've been trying to stock these other strains of lake trout because we lost all our native gene pool, and trying to establish these populations of lake trout since the late 1960s with moderate levels of success. We realized that the lack of natural reproduction from these strains that were stocked was primarily a result of lack of successful reproduction. We were wondering, why is that happening? And it was primarily because, again, the link to invasive species like alewives. The alewives are very effective predators of larval stages of lake trout, as well as other species like yellow perch and walleye. So basically, all the larvae that were being produced by the lake trout that had reached maturity were being consumed by these alewives. So with that collapse of alewives in 2003, we've started to see an increase in natural reproduction of lake trout for the first time in over 50 years. So the progress towards lake trout rehabilitation has been enhanced with the decline of alewives in Lake Huron. Next slide. So the recovery of lake trout has been variable in Lake Huron up until this point, uh, where the exception is Parry Sound, otherwise known as the Big Sound. And that population persisted primarily because there were no major river systems that supported spawning runs of sea lamprey in the area. So they had some refuge from sea lamprey predation, but they certainly were still subject to sea lamprey predation. There were a lot of management changes that were made for that population to protect the adults that persisted. So that would have been taking place in the late 1980s and early 1990s. There were restrictions on the amount of recreational harvest. There was rehabilitative stocking occurring. Some wild egg takes took place in the late 80s and early 1990s to establish a provincial brood source of Parry Sound lake trout. And I just wanted to highlight the graph on the top right, which is a time span from 1998 to 2025, looking at adult catch rates in our index netting that we conduct at various times in the Parry Sound area. And this is one of the good news stories in Lake Huron. We have seen a substantial increase in the abundance of adult lake trout in Parry Sound over the last 25 years. The green line shows the percent of natural fish, so unclipped fish in the population. And you can see that in the last decade, we stopped stocking in about 1998. And since then, lake trout are naturally reproducing. And all the fish we're seeing in the population in recent years are the result of natural reproduction. And we're seeing a good size range of fish, a lot of large adult fish situated not only in one of the sanctuary areas in Parry Sound near Killbear Point, but throughout the Big Sound area. So this has been a success story for reestablishing lake trout in the Great Lakes outside of Lake Superior. So it's a good news story and something that should be celebrated. And it's taking place within the area of the Georgian Bay Association. So it's quite an amazing story. Next slide. I'm going to talk about Lake Whitefish. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a culturally and economically significant fish species for indigenous communities as well as non-native commercial fishers. It's kind of the bread and butter fish of the commercial fishery in Lake Huron. Next slide. Unfortunately, over the last 2 decades, their abundance has declined substantially. And I'll try to explain some of the reasons behind this decline. Again, I could spend a lot of time talking about lake whitefish and their dynamics, but I won't have that luxury tonight. But I'm going to just highlight this graph, which shows the commercial harvest of lake whitefish and other chorogonids like cisco, otherwise known as lake herring, and the bloater chub, which I mentioned earlier. And you could see that in the early 1900s, the harvest of chorogonid species was not dominated by lake whitefish. In fact, lake herring were one of the most abundant species harvested in the commercial fishery, that being cisco. And you could see that this was the case up until the 1940s. And of course, here we have the story of the sea lamprey making their way into the Great Lakes and decimating fish populations, including the Coregonid species. So there was a dramatic decline in lake whitefish and lake herring. And then you saw increases in lake whitefish in the mid 1950s and then declines. So the system was very unstable at that time. And then there was a time when bloater were abundant and they declined. And you can see that in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was an increase in the representation of lake whitefish. In fact, they reached historically high levels of abundance by the late 1990s, early 2000s. And unfortunately, that wasn't a sustainable scenario. Primarily driven by invasive species, Dreissenid mussels, surprisingly, alewives. Alewives are a very effective predator on whitefish eggs, particularly in the spawning shoal areas. And then there's a combination of nutrient declines in the offshore waters. So you can see that there's been a precipitous decline since the late 1990s into the present years. And this has drawn the concern and anxiety of a lot of fish, a lot of communities, indigenous and non-indigenous, throughout the Great Lakes when they see this decline in this significant species. Next slide, please. So what is happening? Again, it highlights the significance of invasive species and their dramatic impact on dynamics of fish communities throughout the lake. This dynamic is being driven by coaga mussels. So coaga mussels act as a nutrient filter, as a vacuum cleaner, so to speak, in the offshore deep waters of the lake. So they occupy the bottom areas of the lake. They filter out all the nutrients that at one time were used by larval fish species like lake whitefish, to the point where when larvae hatch, they have very little food in order to survive. And that's the case throughout Lake Huron, especially in the last 2 decades. So coaga mussels are sequestering all the nutrients in offshore waters. There's very little nutrients in the water column during the spring. So there's no phytoplankton bloom. There's very little zooplankton in the offshore waters. So when the lake whitefish spawn and the eggs hatch, the larvae have very little food and they're just not surviving as well as they have historically. So that is the primary mechanism that most researchers are pointing at for the decline in lake whitefish populations. And the map on the right shows the various sampling locations of the historical spawning grounds for lake whitefish in the lake that we've been studying over the last few years. And basically, it's tracing that decline in larval production throughout Lake Huron. Next slide. So this next slide shows an image of Lake Huron, and you see a bunch of red dots. And basically, what we're trying to do is understand the movement patterns of a variety of fish species through acoustic telemetry. So those dots indicate an acoustic receiver. And these receivers receive information from acoustic tags that send out a sound signal. So we have been tagging lake whitefish since 2020. Next, please. So you could see the image on the left is the receivers that are situated on the bottom of the lake, and they are able to receive signals from acoustic tags that are implanted into the abdomen of a variety of fish species, including lake whitefish. And each of these tags sends out a unique sound signal, which is recorded by the receivers. And annually, we retrieve the receivers. We're able to identify individual fish and look at their movement patterns over the entire year. Historically, the tagging that we used to use, external tags, would only give you an impression of fish movement when the fish was retrieved. So there's a lot of movement that we wouldn't be aware of. Now, these acoustic tags allow us to get an annual cycle of movement patterns for lake whitefish as well as lake trout and lake sturgeon and walleye. So now Lake Huron is basically outfitted for sound, and it's generated a lot of research opportunities for looking at current distributions of fish, how they've been impacted by the changing ecology and food web in the lake, and trying to find insights into what remedial measures we can take to improve the situation with lake whitefish and other species in the lake. Next. This has resulted in a substantial partnership between the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation in the Bruce Peninsula, Saugeen Peninsula area, Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, and Fathom 5 National Marine Park. We've entered into a partnership called Together with Googieg, and we're trying to gain insights about the population dynamics of lake whitefish and lake trout throughout the traditional waters of the Saugeen Territory. And that's been a very productive partnership over the last 6 to 7 years. Next slide. So hopefully you're still with me. Those were the offshore fish species, just some highlights. And now we're going to go into the midshore or nearshore zone and talk about walleye. Next slide. So walleye are a very significant species as well, culturally, economically, recreationally. This is a map depicting the relative abundance of walleye populations throughout Lake Huron. You could see that Saginaw Bay in U.S. waters historically supported the largest biomass of walleye in Lake Huron. And next was the lower main basin of Lake Huron area. That was primarily a population of walleye that originated from Saginaw Bay as well as Western Lake Erie, sorry. So the fish from Western Lake Erie, the walleye, would navigate up the Detroit River and St. Clair River and feed in the southern productive waters of Lake Huron. And these were primarily sub-mature individual walleye. And you could see that the remaining populations are associated with tributary systems draining into Georgian Bay, Eastern Georgian Bay in particular, as well as the North Channel. And although the biomass supported in each of these individual populations wasn't that great, collectively they represented a substantial amount of walleye biomass throughout the lake. And unfortunately, most of the walleye populations throughout Eastern Georgian Bay and the North Channel have been reduced to low levels of abundance for a variety of reasons. Primarily, the alteration of habitats in these tributary systems due to log drives and the construction of dams, and the changes in the prey base for walleye and water clarity have all had an impact. And so we've been trying to rehabilitate walleye for many years as a result of this historic legacy of habitat alteration and overexploitation. Next slide. So it's quite a unique story with walleye. In Saginaw Bay, they have experienced an incredible resurgence in walleye. In recent years, they're estimating that they have over 12 million adult walleye occupying the Saginaw Bay waters. A lot of those fish are emigrating outside of Saginaw Bay and distributing themselves throughout the main basin of Lake Huron. The graph on the bottom right indicates areas in which we've been doing our index netting for walleye throughout Georgian Bay and the North Channel. And you can see that there's a zone there that's in red. And basically that red zone indicates the relative abundance of walleye as being quite low in those areas. And that seems to be symptomatic throughout most walleye populations in Eastern Georgian Bay and the North Channel, with a few exceptions. We're seeing some positive population results in the Shawanaga River as well as the Spanish River in the North Channel. But those are the exceptions. Most of the walleye populations are still at very low levels of abundance throughout Ontario waters of Lake Huron. And we've embarked on the development of a walleye management plan over the last 5 years, trying to understand what steps need to be taken in order to promote the recovery of walleye stocks throughout Ontario waters of Lake Huron. Next slide. I just wanted to give you a sense of how difficult it is to monitor and assess nearshore fish communities in Lake Huron, including walleye. So there's some additional information on this slide. Next, please. This map shows the distribution of nearshore assessment zones that we use to monitor nearshore fish populations. And you could see the names of each of these locations on the map, and the colors indicate different areas. Next, please. So we have these nearshore assessment zones that were established about 10 years ago. And these zones were established to allow us to rotate through sampling locations throughout that vast littoral zone throughout Lake Huron. And basically, we have 59 of these zones. They range in size from 84 to 400 kilometers squared. And just to give you a sense of how large those areas are, for instance, most of you are aware of Lake Muskoka. It's about 120 kilometers squared surface area. So most of our nearshore assessment zones are 2 to 3 times larger than Lake Muskoka, and we have 59 of these. So in essence, we have greater than 100 Lake Muskokas that we need to monitor and assess to get a sense of the dynamics and the distribution of our nearshore fish communities. So it's a daunting task, and I know M&R is doing their best, but it doesn't allow us to look at trend through time information for a large area. So we only have examples in some specific locations that we monitor. So just one of the challenges of trying to monitor nearshore fish communities throughout the lake. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of some of the scale of areas that we have to monitor. So this is below the Moon River Falls. This is in Arnold's Bay, historically important walleye population. And what you see there at the bottom left is a electrofishing boat that uses electricity to temporarily stun fish so that we're able to net them, sample them, tag them, and then release them. So it's a fairly effective way of monitoring fish populations, especially in riverine habitats like the Moon River. Next slide. Lake Huron, including Georgian Bay, has gone through a lot of environmental and ecological changes. Many of you who cottage in the area will know that we experienced very low lake levels from 1999 to 2014. Part of that is the cyclic nature of water level changes in the Great Lakes, including Lake Huron, that have been exacerbated by climate change in recent decades. So what you see here is a depiction or a high resolution photograph of what we refer to as artificial spawning habitats that were constructed below Moon Falls in the Moon River. So this is one of the strategies that we've been using to enhance the reproductive habitats for walleye and for other species like lake sturgeon. So this was a pretty substantial habitat remediation program or project that was conducted in 2008 in the Moon River. Next slide. So I just wanted to, whoops, sorry. Can we go back to that previous slide? I just wanted to highlight the fact that we monitor the Moon River population intermittently. And in 2025, we were back at the Moon River. We think that these spawning substrates are enhancing the reproductive capacity of walleye in this population. The most recent estimate of population abundance was 5 to 6,000 individuals, some over 16 pounds. So Moon River was always renowned for producing large walleye. And we're seeing a stabilizing effect of this habitat. We went down to less than 1,000 spawning individuals in 2012 and 13 in the Moon River. So now we're hopefully on the upswing. So some good news in the Moon River walleye population. Next slide. I'm going to be going through these next slide fairly quickly because I know that I don't have a lot of time. So Next slide. We're going to talk about coastal wetlands. And I'm going to start that out with a video, hopefully with audio. Fingers crossed. Okay, we don't have audio. However, in the absence of very dramatic audio, you could see that this is, here we go. We almost had the audio. This is an example of a netting project in McGregor Bay, so the extreme northern end of Georgian Bay, and it was a spawning survey for muskellunge. And we had Inspired Planet Productions, the documentary crew that I mentioned earlier in All Too Clear, that were able to test some of their equipment, an underwater automated vehicle that collects high resolution images underwater, as well as a drone, as well as high resolution camera images as well. So they went out on the first day of our muskie survey in McGregor Bay and captured some incredible images of muskellunge that were captured in one of our trap nets. The day was perfectly calm and clear. It was our first net set. It's so unpredictable when you're targeting spawning muskellunge. Most net lifts are empty, but in this case, we were able to catch 7 adult mature muskellunge, and the images were able to be captured. And some of these images are featured in that documentary I referred to earlier in the presentation. But you get a sense of the noble muskellunge, and it's a very significant and important nearshore fish predator. From my perspective, I've been studying this species for close to 30 years. And in Georgian Bay in the North Channel, it's a species that's a barometer of the health of nearshore coastal wetlands. Without healthy wetlands, you would not have muskie populations in your waters. So in Georgian Bay and the North Channel, we still have naturally reproducing populations of muskie, which is a good sign that our coastal wetlands are in a good state. Next slide. So this is just an example of some of the sample locations of the muskie surveys that we've conducted over the years. There's a dozen locations in which we've done trap netting in the spring using live capture trap nets to understand the reproductive component of the muskie populations in these areas. So muskie in this location, it represents the largest contiguous population of muskellunge throughout the Great Lakes. So it is something that is unique and special to the east coast of Georgian Bay and the North Channel area. Next slide. This is a summary slide showing the catch rate of muskellunge through various locations that we've sampled throughout eastern Georgian Bay and the North Channel. And basically, it would take me a long time to talk about the nuances of this graph, but it shows that muskellunge are still present in those nearshore coastal waters. In some locations like the Magnetawan River, they're found in fairly high abundance. And again, they're an indicator that the health of wetlands are quite good in most locations of Georgian Bay and the North Channel. Next slide. So here is one of my impact slides showing a large spawning muskellunge, a female muskellunge captured during one of our surveys in the Moon River. And because we've got data over about a 30-year time frame, we're noticing that muskie are spawning earlier over recent years than they were historically. And that's primarily through a general warming trend as a result of climate change. And so we're not sure what the implications of this are on the future state of muskellunge populations, but it's something that will have to be monitored to determine the significance. We've also seen a decline in muskie abundance in places like Severn Sound, where there's been a lot of increase in shoreline development in the last couple of decades. And it's also an area that's influenced by lake levels. So that's another area in which we've got to continue to be vigilant and monitor to see what the impact is on this apex predator. Next slide. So I'm going to be racing through some of this material. I've got about 5 minutes left in the presentation, but I just wanted to highlight some other species of interest to many of you who are recreational anglers who just like fish. So northern pike is another isoscid that's a significant part of the fish community in the nearshore waters. We've been monitoring their abundance through different type of survey designs. Next slide. The type of surveys we use are live capture trap nets set primarily in the spring, as well as summer nets, broad scale monitoring gill nets. So that's a lethal sampling survey that we use intermittently. It does result in the death of fish, but we're able to get a more in-depth look at their fat content, their sex, and diet composition. So we use it discreetly, discriminately, but the trap netting and the graded mesh gill netting are the two types of surveys that we use to monitor nearshore fish communities. So we've been monitoring pike populations. In the last 20 years, their abundance has been fluctuated, probably associated with fluctuating water levels. But in general, since we've introduced more restrictive recreational angling regulations in 2003, we've seen a higher proportion of larger individuals throughout nearshore waters of Georgian Bay and the North Channel. So they are still a significant predator in nearshore waters. Next slide. Bass. So bass are probably the most prominent good news story in Lake Huron. They're a species that has benefited from climate change and warming trends and round goby. So the growth rate has been incredible over the last 20 years. They are feeding effectively on round goby. They're reproducing well, and the young of the year are surviving quite well because they have a longer growing season. Next slide. And I'm sure most of you that recreationally angle for bass will have noticed that there are a lot of bass in nearshore waters, which is in contrast to when I started with the unit back in 1993, where cormorant predation as well as low forage had an impact on bass populations. So they were not nearly as abundant as they have been over the last 10 years. This is just a map showing the fisheries management zones throughout the province. This is how we manage fish populations currently in the province. And I've highlighted in the dashed oval FMZ Fisheries Management Zone 14, which includes Georgian Bay and the North Channel. So I'm going to present some data showing the current size characteristics of smallmouth bass in FMZ 14 compared to the rest of the province. Next slide. This is a graph showing the average maximum total length of smallmouth bass captured in our netting surveys. And it's from various locations. The FMZs are throughout the province. I'm highlighting FMZ 13 and 14. 13 is the main basin of Lake Huron. 14 is Georgian Bay and the North Channel. And I've highlighted those bar and whisker plots. Just take note of the dark line through the box. That's the average maximum size of bass that are captured in our surveys. So you can see that in FMZ 14, that bar is the highest of all the FM zones throughout the province. So that means that we typically catch the largest bass in Georgian Bay and North Channel waters compared to the rest of the areas in the province. And when we look at the trap netting data, we even catch larger fish because those trap nets are set in the spring when smallmouth bass are moving. So basically the take-home message here is that currently we have some of the biggest smallmouth bass throughout the province of Ontario. Couple more slides. We're almost there. I would be remiss in not mentioning channel catfish. This predatory species is found throughout nearshore waters of Georgian Bay and the North Channel, and in some locations they represent 50% of the fish biomass in our trap net lifts. So a significant species that we don't know a lot about, and something that hopefully will be a focus moving forward in terms of looking at the dynamics of fish communities. My last slide. My last slide, and one of my favorite slides, because it shows the beauty of channel catfish. This is an example of a 34-pound channel catfish caught during our trap netting surveys in the Moon River area. Is that not a beautiful fish? Certainly from a biological perspective or a fish biologist perspective, I think it's one of the most beautiful fish that we have in our nearshore waters. So that's it. A brief glimpse into the dynamics of fish communities throughout Lake Huron. And hopefully I've intrigued you, I've informed you, and I've stimulated some thought and questions into the fish communities of Lake Huron. And thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much, Arunas. And apologies for the sound on the video. We did, I assure everybody, we tested this out beforehand and everything was working fine. So, but technology gave us some different ideas when it was live.
It is what it is.
It is
Hopefully
what
I've
it
left some
is.
time for questions.
But honestly, I really liked your voiceover too. It gave a little less dramatic than the music, but a little more information too. So thank you for covering. Yeah, we do have a few questions. And I'll just try to answer them in order. Please keep posting them because we have a little time for questions allotted. The first one speaks to the quagga mussel invasion and whether they're so maybe a slippery slope, but are there beneficial predators for the quaggas? And maybe you can speak to whether what those predators are currently and whether there's anything that would actually be beneficial that could be introduced
Mhm.
to reduce mussel populations in the Great Lakes,
Hopefully
in
my
Lake
comments
Huron.
on invasive species would dissuade the notion of introducing
Yeah.
another predator into the system, because the after effects are in many cases unpredictable and mostly negative. So the quagga and zebra mussels are native to the Ponto-Caspian region, and the round goby evolved with those two species. So the round goby is a predator of quagga and zebra mussels. However, they cannot keep up with the proliferation of Dreissenid mussels. Dreissenid mussels reproduce so effectively, and they really don't have a lot of competition, and they don't have a lot of predators that feed on them. That's why they get so abundant. So round goby feed on zebra and quagga mussels in Lake Huron, but not nearly at a rate that would restrict the abundance of quagga and zebra mussels. Other species, I mentioned lake whitefish. Lake whitefish will consume Dreissenid mussels, but the nutritional benefits are so low that a diet rich in Dreissenid mussels for lake whitefish results in low condition factors. The fish are not as fit as they would be if they were feeding on species like Diparia, and it results in lower reproductive output and lower size characteristics. So their whole life history is altered. They do eat Dreissenids, but they don't get a lot of nutritional benefit. In terms of other species, there's a few fish that will eat them. In fact, I was surprised to know that pumpkin seed eat zebra mussels.
Hmm.
But again, they're a fringe predator. They don't really have an impact on the dynamics of zebra and quagga mussels. So the net impact of overabundant quagga mussels is that they are just locking up nutrients that used to be available to a diversity of fish species historically.
All right. Thank you. Um, so, and maybe still, while we're on the invasive side of things, but there's a question that is wondering whether gobies are considered a good food for bass.
Well, I don't want to speak on behalf of bass, but based upon the diet surveys that have been conducted throughout the Great Lakes and looking at growth characteristics and survival characteristics of smallmouth bass throughout the Great Lakes, where drysenids are established and ground goby are established, goby are very nutritious and they're readily eaten by bass as well as other predatory species, northern pike, walleye, lake trout, rainbow trout. It's amazing the amount of species that feed upon round goby. Even lake whitefish adults will feed
Mm,
on young of the year goby throughout the year. So yes, round goby are now a staple diet item for most predatory species in Lake Huron.
interesting. Um, so there are a couple of questions, actually, both very similar, asking about the status of the salmon population, which was one that you didn't get to. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah.
That'll be
So
part of our half-day workshops to be scheduled at a future time, maybe later this summer or fall. But there's a whole story related to salmon. For those of you who don't know, salmon were introduced. They're not native to the Great Lakes. They were introduced from the west coast of North America and primarily driven by the overabundance of alewives and smelt in the 50s and 60s. Smelt and alewife were so abundant that at times in the spring in particular, when there was high temperature gradients in the nearshore and offshore waters, you'd have these massive die-offs of alewives, and they would wash up on our shoreline areas, in particular in beaches, and they would just be a foul-smelling detraction from enjoying the Great Lakes. So fish managers in the 50s and 60s were trying to find a way of utilizing that prey source in a productive way. And lake trout were still being decimated by lamprey. This was before lamprey control came into place in the 60s. So some of the thoughts were, why don't we introduce a predator like Chinook salmon that fed readily on small pelagic species like alewife, and maybe they could have an impact of reducing the overabundance of prey fish in the offshore waters. And the feeling at that time was because Chinook salmon come from a marine and freshwater ecosystem, that with the absence of a marine phase, they wouldn't reproduce in the Great Lakes. So they were introduced on a trial basis in the late 1960s in the state of Michigan, and they took off like gangbusters. They fed very effectively on schools of alewife and rainbow smelt to the point where you were getting 30 to 35 pound salmon growing in 5 to 6 years in the offshore waters. And once the anglers keyed in on how to effectively target these salmon, it resulted in an incredible recreational fishery in the offshore waters. You saw the development of marinas, specific tackle related to trolling for Chinook salmon, and then subsequently coho salmon and rainbow trout, that there was quite an incredible recreational fishery that was dependent on abundant alewife and smelt populations. Well, I mentioned that in 2003, we saw a collapse of alewife and to a lesser extent smelt in the offshore waters of Lake Huron, primarily driven by Dreissenid mussels and the lack of nutrients in the offshore waters. So subsequent to 2003, we saw a dramatic decline in the biomass of Chinook and coho salmon in offshore waters. There's kind of a new equilibrium that has been established. The biomass of Chinook and coho is much less than it was 20 years ago, but there's also natural reproduction that primarily is driving populations of Chinook and coho salmon. So Chinook salmon are reproducing successfully in most accessible tributary systems in Lake Huron. So they've reached a new equilibrium. Less productive offshore waters means less predators and therefore less Chinook salmon. But they're still certainly out there and they're adapting and adjusting. So hopefully that answers that question. There's a lot more nuances to it, but I think that'll suffice for now.
Right. Well, I think it gives the questioners a lot more context than they previously had. So thank you. Um, I yeah, so we have a lot of questions.
I got time. I'm
And
retired.
well, we'll see how long we can go. At least till the half hour anyway. But we are committed to answering these all in some fashion. We'll post them on the website so people can go there and get a better sense if we don't get to all of them. Um, but so interesting question about Asian carp, and it was rumored that it was coming into the Great Lakes and going to cause a lot of grief. Is this still a risk, or has that been controlled?
Okay, so it's a major risk. The Asian carp have now been referred to as invasive carp. And we already have there's four primary species of invasive carp that are of concern and are situated throughout or established throughout the Mississippi drainage, which connects to the Great Lakes through the Chicago Sanitary Canal. So that's the connection to the Great Lakes. Um, One species in particular has been established in the Great Lakes, primarily in the Sandusky and Maumee River in Ohio in Lake Erie. It's reproducing. That's the grass carp. And various agencies are trying to reduce their abundance, try to prevent the expansion of this species throughout the rest of the Great Lakes. The history of invasive species has been once it's become established, once it's reproducing in an area, inevitably it expands its territory. So there's quite a major concern over the expansion of grass carp outside of Lake Erie. And reason why there's such concern about grass carp is that they are primarily a species that is herbivorous. It feeds on aquatic macrophytes, coastal wetlands, vegetation. It has the capacity to decimate coastal wetlands throughout the Great Lakes. There have been some studies done on this significance of this species and the risk level throughout the Great Lakes. And basically, outside of Lake Superior, there are suitable habitats throughout the remaining Great Lakes that could support populations of grass carp. So I could go on about grass carp. It's a major concern. It's established. And again, it's one of these consequences of invasive species becoming established in the Great Lakes and just wreaking ecological havoc on fish communities. So definitely a concern. Don't get me going about silver carp and black carp, and there's one that escapes me right now. But yes, it's still a major concern amongst fisheries managers throughout the Great Lakes.
Yeah, and those nearshore areas are such important components of the whole system for nurseries and spawning,
Yes.
and yeah. Well, so maybe to counter that rather depressing outlook, but accurate. Um, it, uh, there's a question about your presentation did suggest some hopeful signs for certain populations and recovery in some cases. So how do you see the future unfolding for fish in Georgian Bay?
Well, great question. And maybe I can answer it differently now that I'm retired and not a government representative.
Please proceed.
Maybe I could be more frank and honest. Um, with the advent of Dreissenid mussels, round goby, spiny water flea, potentially invasive carp, it's so unpredictable to look at the future and really be confident and trying to figure out what the future composition of fish communities will be in Lake Huron and the Great Lakes. Oh, it's a balance between some signs of hope, but also balanced by some really serious detrimental situations in the Great Lakes. So we've got to learn to live with this new dynamic of invasive species and a dynamic lower food web that's transitioning in front of our eyes. In some cases, um, Dreissenid mussels have clarified the water, made them nutrient poor to the detriment of species like lake whitefish, but it's also resulted in the almost collapse of alewife populations. And alewife, with their decline, has resulted in better reproductive conditions for species like lake trout. I didn't have the chance to go on into the nuances, but lake trout diets heavy with alewife result in very poor reproductive capacities or capabilities because alewife have a enzyme thymidase which breaks down vitamin B, which is an essential element for developing lake trout embryos. So lake trout not eating junk food in the form of alewife are now eating junk food in the form of gobies, which don't have high thymidase levels, which has resulted in lake trout being able to reproduce naturally in Lake Huron, which we haven't seen when alewife were very abundant. So again, it's so complex. It really requires a workshop to go over all the linkages, all the nuances. So I don't know if I really effectively answered that question other than to say that it's a very dynamic and much more unpredictable situation that we're looking at moving into the future. So I wish I could be more optimistic. I didn't even mention models that show much more dynamic lake level changes moving forward into the future and how that's going to impact nearshore fish communities and offshore fish communities. So I wish I could be more optimistic. It's just that we're undergoing a reality check now, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you can only be as optimistic as reality dictates. And part of it, I guess, is just protecting what we have as well.
Yes,
Because without that, that's just an additional stress beyond all the ones that you mentioned.
exactly.
A related question, given the challenges you've highlighted for fish populations, should anglers focus on catch and release instead of catching for food or trophies?
Hmm. Hmm. That's a great question. And it all depends on your context. We're privileged to be able to recreational fish. Uh, we don't sustain ourselves necessarily on the fish we catch. Although some communities, indigenous communities in particular, still rely on healthy fish populations in order to support their communities. But from a recreational perspective, I'll highlight one example, and that's the muskellunge. So muskellunge is an apex predator. It's a keystone predator in the nearshore. It's a barometer of the health of nearshore coastal wetlands. We are still seeing that population or those populations persist in our waters. And I think one of the only reasons that's happening is because of catch and release as an ethic being used by recreational muskellunge anglers. They are predominantly catch and release anglers, and they've adopted handling techniques that ensure the health of the fish that they capture. And that's resulted in the persistence of these large adult predatory fish in our waters. If you look at global trends in predatory species, they are predominantly in decline throughout the globe, through marine ecosystems and freshwater ecosystems. Those large keystone apex predators are in serious declines throughout um, aquatic ecosystems. You look at Eastern Georgian Bay and the North Channel, and you have muskellunge. You still have muskellunge large individuals that persist. And that's in the midst of intense angling pressure. So catch and release can be something to utilize to protect fish populations into the future. I would say just moderate your consumption, moderate your extraction, because we're seeing that with walleye. There's such a popular fish in the recreational fishery that when their numbers decline, you kind of got to give them an opportunity to increase. And the only way you can do that is through catch and release or reducing your extraction of walleye from the system. So, yes, catch and release can be an important tool to preserve fish populations in various locations.
Okay. Um, and I think we're nearing our end, but I know how much you like catfish. So there's a question
Oh,
here about catfish.
thank goodness.
To what extent do you estimate catfish themselves make up the diet of other nearshore predatory species like pike and muskie?
That's a mystery. That's a mystery. Our netting is primarily focused on adult members of that species just because of the composition of our nets. There's, um, fairly relatively large mesh sizes, so you're only going to get large individuals in our trap nets. And channel catfish move around in the spring seeking spawning locations primarily from large tributary systems that are draining into eastern shores of Georgian Bay and into the North Channel. We know next to nothing about their early life history stages. We catch very few juvenile channel catfish. We do get a few. They're very distinct. Their coloration patterns are so distinct from the adults. Adults can be blue, dark blue to black. Juveniles are spotted and have a light gray background. But we rarely see the young of the year, yearlings, 2-year-old fish. So I don't know whether they serve as prey for other species. I do know that in the muskie world, brown bullhead, which is a smaller member of the catfish family, it's found in the gut contents of some of the muskie that are kept in the recreational fishery and some of the dead fish that we find washed up every now and then inshore. So muskellunge will feed on brown bullhead. So, maybe they'll feed on channel catfish juveniles as well. But that's a bit of a mystery. We really don't know at this point.
All right. Thank you. Um, Meredith, did you want to jump in?
Well, I actually would like to stay and listen for another hour or two, but I'm afraid we do need to start to sign off. So I want to reassure everybody that tomorrow we're going to send out an email with a link to the recording of tonight's awesome webinar. And we're also going to send Arunas the questions, and he and Jim are going to work through sending out answers. So I will check in with Arunas and Jim tomorrow, and we'll see what's a logical timeline to promise, because we really do have lots and we want to answer them well. So if you've successfully registered for this webinar and shown up, we have an email address for you, and so you will receive the answers to these questions when we have them ready. Thank you so much for this, Arunas and Jim. Thank you for rolling with the tech and for being up for taking us through your expertise. We really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. And if I may add that if there's any appetite for some sort of fisheries workshop at a future date to expand upon the nuances of fish dynamics, you know my number.
Thank you.
Perfect. Yes. Thanks so much.
That sounds wonderful. And for all of you listening, feel free to contact us through the Georgian Bay Association website. If you have additional questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you how this went.